I'm Inspector Morse, and I solve mysteries. Every silence hides a truth. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that afternoon with a precision that embarrasses me, though I had no reason then to mark it in my mind. October had begun its slow surrender, and the trees along the Cherwell leaned inward as if confiding something only the river could keep. A faint mist lifted from the water, not yet cold enough to bite, but enough to blur the outlines of punts moored like forgotten punctuation marks. I walked without destination, my coat heavy at the shoulders, a copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse folded under one arm. Somewhere behind the memory of my own steps lay a line of George Herbert, misquoted at a college debate years before. The glass shows not the face, but the soul's residue. Not his line at all, yet it had stayed with me more stubbornly than the original. I'd corrected no one at the time. These days I rarely did. The error, like the mist, gave the words a softer edge. The bells of a chapel, St. Hilda's, I think, tolled across the water. Their sound drifted above the damp reeds, above the gentle swan movements of undergraduates pretending not to be lost. I could almost hear the stones of the city absorb it, those stones blackened by rain and centuries of recited Latin. It was a sound that made one feel less alone, even in solitude. Somewhere within that echo, there came a thread of laughter, light, feminine, and unclaimed. It passed across my hearing like a half-remembered aria, so quick I wondered if it had been the cry of a gull. I turned, slowly, as though not wanting to startle it, but saw only a cyclist on the far path, head bent against the wind. She did not laugh. I continued walking, though the sound stayed with me. One develops, in my profession, an ear for the thing that doesn't belong, a misplaced file, an unfiled key, a tremor in an otherwise steady voice. This was nothing, of course. An afternoon, a river, a laugh. Still, my fingers tightened on the book as if it might anchor me. A crossword clue stirred in my pocket, scribbled on the back of an envelope from the morning's post. Glass image reversed holds another face. 7. I'd written it myself in a half-waking moment. The answer refused to appear, though I knew it sat within reach, like a shy bird in a hedge. I thought of Herbert again, of mirrors and souls, of how a word can stand backward and still reveal its meaning. Rain began as a fine mist, then a more deliberate drizzle. It clung to my hair and glasses, distorting the already blurred scene. Across the water, the college roofs sharpened briefly in a shaft of weak sun before fading back into grey. The smell of wet paper came from my coat pocket. A note from Lewis about a minor theft in Jericho. I had not yet read it. I paused on the footbridge. Beneath me, the river moved without urgency, a slow green mirror carrying fragments of fallen leaves. I imagined the laughter again, now behind me, now ahead. For a moment I saw, or thought I saw, a figure in a pale coat at the far bend, pausing as if to watch me. When I blinked, the path was empty. Some cases begin with a body, some with a call. This one began, if it began at all, with a misquotation and a sound that might not have been laughter. I stood there longer than necessary, the crossword clue in my pocket like an unopened letter, the river reflecting a sky that had already turned the colour of pewter. When at last I moved on, I caught myself muttering the line again, not Herbert's, but the wrong version, and wondering why the wrong words sometimes last longer than the right. The bells had ceased, leaving a quiet so complete it felt rehearsed. My steps on the wet boards were the only sound, and even they seemed borrowed from someone else's memory. I walked back towards the city, the mist closing behind me like a curtain. The answer to the clue flickered at the edge of thought and withdrew, as if to remind me that some solutions arrive only when one has forgotten the question. And though no crime had yet touched my day, I felt, with the certainty that comes before reason, that something had already begun. Lewis arrived at my flat just after dusk, bringing with him the smell of damp pavements and cold metal from the station's railings. I heard his boots on the stairwell before the knock, a steady, unhurried sound, like the beat of a muffled drum. I had been reading a minor Elizabethan poet at the time, something about glass and memory, though the words slipped from my mind as I opened the door. He held an envelope between two fingers as if it were a dead moth. "No stamp," he said, "no return address either." It had been found beneath the duty sergeant's window ledge at noon, though no one had seen who placed it there. A joke, perhaps. A warning, perhaps. He handed it to me with the faintest shrug. I closed the door behind us. The flat smelled of whiskey and cold paper. I left the curtains drawn against the sodium streetlight and opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet. The handwriting was neat, but oddly uneven, as though someone had tried to copy their own script. Faces mirrored, yet never the same. Glass remembers what skin forgets. Find the truth behind the frame. That was all. No greeting, no signature. Lewis waited, standing near the bookcase, his eyes traveling the rows of titles he had never borrowed. He said it looked like a prank to him, some undergraduate's idea of a riddle. I told him that undergraduates rarely choose rag paper for their mischief. He asked how I knew it was rag. I held the sheet to the lamp and let the thin light travel through its fibers. "There," I said. "See the watermark?" Not the college crest one might expect, but a faint heraldic lion with a crown, the sort of mark used by a now-defunct stationer on the high street, Cartwright's, which had closed a decade ago. Whoever sent this letter had either a fondness for old supplies or access to a place where such paper lingered forgotten. Lewis asked if that meant anything. I said it meant whoever wrote this had prepared it long before posting, or rather, before slipping it under the window. It was a small deduction, but small deductions sometimes become the whole case. The poem itself resisted me. Its rhythm was deliberately uneven, almost like a mistranslation. Faces mirrored, yet never the same. A line that smelt faintly of plagiarism from some Renaissance source, though I could not place it. Glass remembers what skin forgets. The sort of phrase a chaplain might utter at a memorial, or a photographer to his dark room. Find the truth behind the frame. Was it an invitation, a threat? Lewis said, "You look as if you've seen a ghost." I told him ghosts rarely write poems. He smiled faintly, then glanced at the crossword folded on my armchair. He said I hadn't finished the clue about mirrors. I told him I was waiting for the answer to present itself. He shook his head, a gesture of good-natured defeat, and muttered about real crimes requiring real evidence. After he left, the room felt heavier. I laid the letter on the table beside my whiskey and ran my thumb over the watermark again, feeling its slight ridge under the lamp's glow. A lion with a crown, Cartwright's paper, a poem that misquotes or half-remembers. The shape of a puzzle was forming, though no crime had yet been named. Outside, the streetlight flickered. In the silence that followed, I thought I heard the same laugh from the riverbank, faint and impossible, drifting through the brickwork as though Oxford itself were whispering an unfinished line. I did not move. The envelope lay open like a pale mouth, waiting to speak. I had not set foot in St. Hilda and Cuthbert for more than a decade. It had been, even then, a shy sort of college, tucked away from the arterial streets, its quadrangles small and hedged as if it wished to conceal its own age. That autumn it was half wrapped in scaffolding, the stone walls draped with protective netting like veils at a funeral. Rainwater trickled from the guttering and darkened the limestone until it looked almost bruised. The banners announcing the 400th anniversary sagged in the damp air, their gilt letters dulled. Lewis and I crossed the courtyard under a sky the color of pewter. The smell was of wet earth, plaster dust and an older scent of books kept too long in storerooms. It mingled with the faint sweetness of sherry that had spilled somewhere, though no glass was in sight. A junior bursar waited for us at the bottom of a flight of stone stairs, his academic gown clinging to his shoulders like a dark wing. He spoke with a briskness that almost concealed his unease. "Dr. Marston has not been seen since last evening," he said, "last sighted leaving the senior common room after sherry at 9. Her rooms are locked from within." He glanced up at the college clock as he spoke, as though time itself might provide an alibi. Lewis asked about family, visitors, feuds. The bursar's eyes flickered towards the upper windows, but he said only that Dr. Marston kept to herself, mostly in the library's rare books room, cataloguing a donation of early devotional texts. He said she was preparing a lecture for the anniversary, though he did not know the subject. We followed him through a cloister whose floorboards creaked in protest under our steps. On one wall hung a fading portrait of the college's founder, the eyes repainted at some point, the paint thicker there, as if to deepen the scrutiny. I caught a glint of glass above the frame, a small mirror affixed awkwardly, perhaps to allow the porter a view of the corridor from his desk. It showed our passage in miniature, reversed and dim. Faces mirrored, yet never the same, I thought, and felt the letter's words stir again. The bursar produced a key and led us to Dr. Marston's staircase. The air smelled of polish and dust. He stopped at the landing and gestured to a heavy oak door. "Locked since last night," he said. The bedmaker had tried this morning, but found the bolt shot from the inside. I knelt and examined the keyhole. No light, no movement within. Lewis tried the handle, and it held firm. A window at the corridor's end looked out over the inner quad. Rain streaked the glass, bending the view so that the scaffolding swayed like ghostly rigging. I asked the bursar about the senior common room, who had been there. He listed names quickly. Professor Vale, Father Doran, Lucinda Sharp, the doctoral student, a visiting scholar from Durham. The sherry had been plentiful, he added, almost apologetically. No one had seen Dr. Marston after she left. As he spoke, I noticed a small smear of white on his cuff, fine as chalk. Plaster dust from the renovations, perhaps, but it caught my attention. A crossword clue from that morning returned unbidden. Hidden room, secret within walls. 5. The answer still escaped me, but hovered close. We stood a moment longer before the locked door, each of us listening for a sound from within. Only the faint dripping of rain in the gutter answered. The bursar shifted his weight, and the boards creaked again, an echo of something older than our presence. I told Lewis we would need the locksmith, but not yet. "There are doors," I said, "that open more easily from the inside when one knows where to look." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The bursar cleared his throat, a dry sound swallowed by the damp corridor. When we left the staircase, the portrait's eyes seemed to follow us. Outside, the rain had thickened and the college bell began to toll for evensong. Its notes rolled across the quadrangles like a warning. In the mirror above the frame, I caught a glimpse of my own face, and for an instant it seemed not my own, but someone waiting behind me. The rain slackened to a fine mist as Lewis and I moved along the cloister. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, deliberate beats, like the measure of a metronome keeping time with our questions. We had arranged, without much ceremony, to meet each of them in a room off the quadrangle, a narrow chamber with a single leaded window whose glass trembled slightly under the wind. The scent inside was a mixture of candle wax, damp stone, and an older odor of ink that had seeped into the wood. Professor Adrian Vale arrived first. He walked with the sort of measured slowness that suggested resentment at being summoned. His coat hung open though the air was chill, and his eyes carried that faint glaze of someone accustomed to audiences who cannot interrupt him. He sat without waiting to be asked. Lewis took notes while I listened to Vale's voice thread its way through old grievances. He spoke of Elaine Marston as though she had been a promising student who had forgotten her place. She had, he said, undermined his own paper on Shakespeare's lost sources, claiming his footnotes were a century out of date. I noticed as he gestured that his cuff bore a faint smear of red. Wine, perhaps, though he claimed to have been in the library all evening. When he spoke of her last night at Sherry, his tone became almost theatrical, as if rehearsed. A small slip. He said the sherry had been served in the north parlour. In fact, the renovations had closed that room for months. Lucinda Sharp entered next, tall, narrow-shouldered, and wrapped in a coat of pale grey wool that threw back the dim light. She had a way of lowering her gaze while speaking, as though her words emerged from some interior study. She called Elaine Marston brilliant but careless, the kind who borrowed books and returned them annotated in another hand. She herself was writing on mirror imagery in Renaissance poetry, and said, with a glint of self-mockery, that everyone here seemed to be writing about mirrors. She smiled when she said she had last seen Dr. Marston leaving the senior common room, but her smile faltered when I asked which book Elaine had borrowed from her. She named the title quickly, too quickly, and in so doing misquoted its subtitle, reversing 2 words. A small reversal, like the reflection of a line in glass. I made a note on the envelope of my crossword. Father Colin Doran came last, and the chamber changed temperature with him. He was shorter than I remembered, his cassock clean but creased at the cuffs, eyes alert behind their calm. He apologized for being late. Evensong rehearsal had run over. He spoke of Elaine in tones of pastoral regret, emphasizing her contributions to the anniversary committee, her love of devotional texts. He poured himself a small measure from a flask he produced without embarrassment, and offered none to us. I watched his hands as he spoke. The left thumb rubbed the rim of the cap as though tracing a circle. He said he had left the senior common room just before 9, had seen Elaine at the door, but not after. When I asked about the wine cellars he kept for the college, his mouth softened into a smile that was not quite a smile. By the time we stepped back into the cloister, the mist had thickened again, softening the outlines of the arches and making the lamps smear their light along the wet stones. Lewis asked quietly which of them I believed. I told him belief was not the point. Pattern was. The crossword clue in my pocket read, "Reflection holds truth backward." 6. Still unanswered, but nearer. As we crossed the quadrangle, I felt the damp air tighten around us, as if the college itself were listening. I still see that room before I close my eyes at night. It lay at the end of a neglected corridor whose stone floor dipped slightly at the center, as if bowed by centuries of footsteps. The door had been locked, but not bolted, its iron key left to rust in a porter's drawer until Lewis fetched it. A faint smell of damp velvet clung to the air, the kind one finds in unopened trunks. When we stepped inside, our reflections rose around us like a congregation waiting for an unspoken sermon. The mirror room, they called it once, though no one could say why it had been built. Its walls were lined with tall Venetian mirrors in frames of tarnished silver and cracked gilt. The mirrors faced each other in a long sequence so that the eye met corridor upon corridor of fading selves. Even the faint light from the corridor candles seemed to hesitate, as though caught in a loop. I remember Lewis muttering under his breath and then falling silent. Elaine Marston lay near the far wall, her head turned slightly as though listening. She wore the same dark skirt I'd seen her in 2 days before, but her hands were empty. No notebook, no papers, only the shallow imprint of where something rectangular had rested beside her. The skin of her face looked almost translucent under the reflected light, as if she were already dissolving into glass. There was no sign of forced entry. The window shutters were closed from within. I knelt without touching her. The floor beneath smelled faintly of wine and wax. Lewis began a quiet inventory. position of the body, state of the locks, absence of footprints except our own. I drifted instead toward the nearest mirror. Its surface bore the scars of age, fine cracks running like frozen lightning. In one upper corner, someone had etched a line of verse. At first glance, I thought it a scratch, but the letters formed words. The glass shows not the face, but the soul's residue. It stopped me. The misquotation I had heard years before at a debate. The one I had repeated by the river. Not Herbert's line, yet here again, fixed in silver. Someone had either known my memory or shared it. The room blurred for a moment, all those reflections folding inward like a deck of cards. Lewis said her notes are missing, Chief. He had searched her bag, her pockets. The rare poem she had been working on, nothing left. Only a torn slip of paper near the skirting board, blank on one side, faint watermark of a crowned lion on the other. Cartwright's paper again. I asked who had them. Keys. The bursar, perhaps, or the chaplain. Lewis said only two existed, both in the porter's safe until this morning. I said nothing. In one mirror, my own face looked older than I felt, the lines sharper, the eyes less forgiving. I walked the perimeter slowly. The frames held dust at their corners, yet one frame near the center shone as though recently handled. A narrow smear, perhaps from a gloved hand, trailed across its edge. In its reflection, I caught a glimpse of Lewis crouching by the body, his head bent, and behind him, repeated endlessly, myself moving through a hall of distorted doubles. The crossword clue in my pocket read, "Soul seen backwards in glass." 4. Still unsolved, but now it pressed against my palm like a pulse. I wondered if Elaine had seen something in these mirrors that had unsettled her, or if someone had chosen the room precisely for its silence, its infinite regress. We stood there longer than we should. Lewis shifted his weight, the floorboards creaked, and our reflections trembled. Outside the rain had stopped, but water still fell from the gutters in slow drops, a sound like a clock running down. I reached out and traced the misquoted line with one finger. The silver felt cold and faintly greasy. When we left, the porter closed the door behind us with a heavy click. I heard my own footsteps echo along the corridor, but could not tell for a moment if they were ahead of me or behind. The mirror room remained locked, its many faces keeping their counsel. I remember the rain that morning more clearly than the paper in my hands. It fell without urgency, soaking the college cloisters until their stones darkened like old vellum. Lewis had spread the evidence across a table in the bursar's office, and for a moment it resembled a still life of accusation. An annotated timetable in Professor Vale's cramped script, a brass key to the mirror room whose teeth caught the weak light, and a letter, brittle with age, in which Vale had written of Elaine Marston with a venom that surprised even me. Lewis said the case had arranged itself, neat as a set of chessmen. Vale had motive, opportunity, and access. He had argued with Elaine over authorship, had mocked her lecture notes, had been seen near the staircase after sherry. His timetable placed him in the north parlor at the very hour she vanished, and yet the north parlor had been sealed for repairs. Lewis said it was a lie caught in its own mirror. I studied the key. It was polished in a way the others were not, as though handled more than once in recent days. But the porter swore both keys had remained locked in the safe until that morning. The bursar, pale and restless, hovered near the window and watched the rain. He muttered something about Vale's temper, his declining health, his resentment of younger scholars. I read the letter again. The phrases were fierce but curiously formal, like the language of a scholar writing to himself. It called Elaine a thief of ideas, a desecrator of texts, but it lacked the small slippages of real anger. No ink blotches, no hurried scrawl. Even the date was written out in Roman numerals, a habit Vale had abandoned years ago. Lewis asked what I thought. I said only that the evidence felt like a crossword whose answers all fit, but yielded no theme. no satisfying click at the end. A puzzle completed by someone who had memorized the solution rather than solved it. I walked to the window. Rain streaked the glass, breaking the view of the quadrangle into slow-moving shards. Students crossed with heads bent, their umbrellas' black flowers opening and closing. I thought of the misquoted Herbert line in the mirror room, etched like a signature only I would recognize. Faces mirrored, yet never the same. On the table, the timetable lay open at the hour of 9. Vale's handwriting was unmistakable, but a single letter, a capital G, curled differently from his usual style. I had noticed the same curl once before in another hand, though I could not yet place it. My pencil hovered above the page, drawing a line in air that I did not commit to paper. Lewis said the magistrate would be pleased. We had key, letter, timetable, even a motive grand enough for the headlines. I told him headlines were rarely a measure of truth. He gave a small laugh, not unkind, and began collecting the papers into a folder. As he did so, a crossword clue drifted back. Perfect fit conceals false core. 6. Unsolved, like all the others. I felt its shape without knowing the word. Outside, the rain eased, leaving a pale smear of sunlight across the leaded panes. The bursar shifted, and a fleck of plaster fell from his cuff onto the sill. I turned back to the evidence and saw it suddenly for what it was. Not proof, but arrangement, like mirrors set at angles to show whatever one wished to see. I did not yet know whose hand had tilted them, but I felt, with that quiet certainty which arrives before reason, that Professor Vale was not the end of the puzzle, but its first reflection. The lounge at the Randolph had the muted glow of an old theater between performances. Lampshades the color of parchment softened the light. The carpet's pattern held centuries of footsteps pressed into its fibers. I had chosen a corner seat beneath a gilt-framed print of some minor Victorian painter whose name I never remembered. Outside, the city drifted past in a drizzle that flattened the streetlights into trembling coins. The waiter knew me well enough to leave the bottle without fuss. Barolo, a glass that promised warmth without absolution. I held it near the lamp and watched the light tremble in its depths. On the table lay the anonymous poem, unfolded once again like a wound I could not stop prodding. Faces mirrored, yet never the same. Glass remembers what skin forgets. Find the truth behind the frame. I mouthed the lines silently, hearing their uneven meter as if a second hand had written over the first. Around me, the lounge murmured with low voices. A retired don describing his ailments to a companion. A couple debating train times in whispers. The sound of cutlery on china, all of it blurred, like a radio between stations. My mind returned instead to the mirror room, to Elaine Marston's body lying as though she had been listening to something only she could hear. The phone in my coat vibrated against the chair back. Lewis. His voice came through the small speaker, roughened by static but steady. They'd found a missing page from Elaine's diary tucked inside a music score in the library. An entry dated a week before her death. She had written of a confession behind glass, a phrase underlined twice. Lewis said he didn't know what it meant, but thought I would. I asked him to read the rest, but the page ended there, torn at the lower edge. After we rang off, I left the phone on the table beside the poem. Confession behind glass. The words moved like pieces of an old puzzle whose picture I had once known. In the college chapel, not the main nave but the side oratory, there had been years ago a confessional of peculiar design hidden behind a panel of mirrored glass. It had been installed, I remembered now, by a wealthy benefactor obsessed with the idea of seeing penitents without being seen. The mirrored surface had since been painted over, or so I had been told. I traced the poem's final line with my finger. Find the truth behind the frame. The mirrored confessional, perhaps forgotten by everyone but a few old porters. Could Elaine have discovered it during her research? Could someone have used it to watch her? The Barolo had warmed my throat, but not my hands. I turned the glass slowly, the wine forming a dark spiral like ink in water. In its reflection on the table's polished wood, I caught a faint shimmer of my own face, warped and doubled. For a moment it looked like a stranger watching me read. A crossword clue surfaced in my mind without my bidding, silent penitent seen in reverse. 7. I did not write it down. The answer hovered, elusive but near. I folded the poem and slipped it back into my coat. Around me the lounge continued its muted life. A spoon clinked, a chair shifted, a door closed softly as though careful not to wake someone. I finished the wine and left without calling for another. The drizzle had become rain, the kind that darkens stone until it looks like wet slate. Walking back across Beaumont Street, I felt the city's breath on my neck, an old scent of wet paper and iron. Confession behind glass. The words pulsed in time with my steps. Somewhere in the college a hidden mirror waited, holding not my face, but someone else's secret. It was late afternoon when the bursar handed me the photograph, his fingers hesitant as though it might break. The rain had left the college quadrangle slick and shining, and the air carried that smell of wet stone and chalk dust that always follows a day of renovations. I sat alone in the senior common room beneath a portrait of some long-dead benefactor and studied the image in the half-light, my whiskey untouched beside me. It was a formal college photograph taken perhaps 20 years earlier. The faces were a little blurred by time, but not enough to soften the undercurrents of ambition and rivalry. Elaine Marston stood near the center, her hair darker then, her smile uncertain. To her left, Father Doran appeared younger, his expression already composed into the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to secrets. Further along the row stood Adrian Vale, lean and almost elegant, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the camera. I held the photograph at arm's length, and then closer. Lucinda Sharp had claimed to have been at that event, a student volunteer at the anniversary reception, yet her face was nowhere in the frame. It might have been nothing. An absence explained by a late arrival, a camera misfire. Still, the space where she should have been felt too neat, as though someone had brushed a crumb from a table. At the far edge of the photograph, a small smudge caught my eye. Not a stain, but a thinning of the emulsion, like the faint ghost of an erased word. When I tilted it under the lamp, a curve appeared, the trace of a shoulder, perhaps, or a hand. A cropped-out fourth figure. Lewis came in quietly, rain still on his coat. He asked if I'd eaten. I said no and passed him the photograph. He peered at it, shrugged, said perhaps Lucinda had been standing out of frame. He asked what I was looking for. I told him nothing in particular, which was true enough. He placed a slip of paper on the table. The librarian's note about the mirrored confessional, a brief confirmation that such a thing had existed. He said the panels had been boarded up years ago, but a workman found one last month behind a plaster partition. He asked if that meant anything. I said it might, but not yet. While he spoke, I traced the smudge again with my thumb, careful not to damage the image. A crossword clue from the morning floated back. Image holds hidden name. 5. Unsolved still, but the shape of it lingered. Perhaps the photograph was another clue, a mirror and paper showing not what was there, but what had been removed. Lewis said he would see about the parish records, perhaps find who attended that reception. He took the photograph from me to copy it, then hesitated, his eyes narrowing at the smudge. He asked if I thought someone had altered it. I told him Oxford has a long memory, but a selective one. When he left, the room returned to its usual hush. I poured the whiskey at last and let it rest in my hand. Through the rain-streaked window, the chapel's spire bent slightly in the watery glass, as if leaning closer to hear. Elaine's younger face looked back at me from the photograph with a kind of premonition, her eyes not on the camera, but on whoever had stood just beyond it. I set the photograph down but did not turn it over. The smudge, at its edge, seemed to darken in the fading light. A cropped-out fourth figure, or merely my imagination. In Oxford, one learns that the difference between absence and concealment is often only the width of a frame. I read the poem again that night with the patience of a man turning an old key in a stubborn lock. Outside my flat, the rain had deepened to a steady hiss, the kind that blurs the city into one continuous shadow. The lamp on my desk cast a yellow circle over the paper, and within that circle the handwriting looked more fragile than before, as though it might crumble if I breathed too hard. Faces mirrored, yet never the same. Glass remembers what skin forgets. Find the truth behind the frame. I had recited those lines so often that their rhythm had become a pulse in my head. This time I let my eyes drift not across, but down the page. The first letters of each line, F, G, F, seemed meaningless until I noticed, in a margin faintly indented by a pen's pressure, a second stanza that had been erased or written over. Letters crowded faintly like ghosts beneath the ink. When I traced them with a pencil's edge, they surfaced one by one. C. An acrostic, then. Not Vale, but Lucinda Sharp, hiding in plain sight. The anonymous poem had been a signature reversed. My first small satisfaction of the case arrived, muted but unmistakable, like the click of a tumbler falling into place. Yet even as the letters formed her name, they refused to settle. Lucinda's manner during our interview had been too careful, her corrections too precise. She had spoken of mirrors as though quoting someone else's dream, and when she mentioned a mirror confession, her voice had carried the faint tremor of someone saying a word that belongs to another language. I pushed the paper aside and poured a measure of whiskey, the liquid dark as ink. Through the window the streetlights flickered in the rain and cast reflections on the glass like a row of watchful eyes. I took out the photograph of the college reception and laid it next to the poem. Elaine's younger face looked up at me, Father Doran and Vale at her side, and at the margin that pale smudge of a fourth figure. Lucinda's absence had become another presence. Lewis had rung earlier to confirm that Elaine had been preparing a paper on a rare Renaissance text, a work long thought lost, but fragments of which had surfaced in the college archives. Lucinda Sharp's dissertation drew heavily from the same text. It would have been a quiet scandal, the sort of academic theft whispered about in libraries but never named aloud. I read the poem again, slower, faces mirrored yet never the same. The line no longer felt like a metaphor, but an instruction. Glass remembers what skin forgets. Find the truth behind the frame. In my mind, the mirrored confessional of the chapel rose again, its panels sealed but not erased. Confession behind glass. Perhaps Elaine had threatened to expose Lucinda there, believing the place private. Or perhaps Lucinda had lured her, thinking the mirrors would hold silence. A crossword clue from the week before drifted back. Reverse confession reveals author. 8. I had left it blank then, but now the answer flickered. Anagoria. No, anagoge. No, something else just out of reach. I set down my pencil. In my trade, certainty comes in whispers, not proclamations. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into semi-darkness. The poem lay on the desk like a pale moth, wings spread. Lucinda's name had risen from its body but not yet taken flight. The mirror confession remained a phrase without anchor, a door half open on a corridor of reflections. In the silence, I thought I heard again the woman's laughter from the riverbank, faint and impossibly far. It passed through the glass without leaving a mark. The city outside smelled of rain on stone, and the whiskey in my hand tasted of iron. Somewhere in the college a hidden mirror waited, holding not only a confession, but perhaps another face, one I had not yet recognized. I went back to the chapel alone before dawn, when the college still lay under that thin hush which belongs to libraries before opening hours. The rain had stopped, but the stones underfoot held its scent, a kind of cold ink rising from the flagstones. My footsteps along the aisle were muffled by dust sheets draped over pews for the renovation. Even the stained glass looked asleep, its saints dulled by morning grey. At the far end, behind the carved screen, the old confessional waited. Workmen had left their tools piled neatly like surgical instruments. The mirrored panel was still there beneath a film of paint and plaster, reflecting only a pale shimmer of my outline. I ran my hand along its frame, feeling for a seam. The wood was smooth except at the base where one corner dipped slightly, as though bearing weight it had not been designed to hold. Lewis had offered to come, but I told him no. Some things required solitude. I crouched and pressed at the warped section. It yielded with the reluctant sigh of something long hidden. Behind it, a narrow cavity opened, no larger than a ledger, lined with faded velvet. Inside lay a bundle of papers, tied with a dark ribbon. Elaine Marston's missing notes, and, folded beneath them, a draft will naming Father Colin Doran as her literary executor. I did not lift them immediately. The chapel smelled of wax and plaster dust, of prayers sealed in for years. A drop of water fell from the ceiling and struck the floor with the sound of a metronome ticking. In the mirror's faint reflection, my face looked older than the one I carried out in daylight. When at last I opened the bundle, her handwriting stared up at me in careful loops. Notes on the rare text, fragments cross-referenced with Lucinda Sharp's dissertation, marginalia about a confession behind glass, and the will, unsigned but unmistakable, conferring rights and revenues to Doran. The ribbon left a faint red line on my palm. I remembered his thumb circling the flask's cap during our interview, the way he had paused before mentioning Elaine's lecture. A small deduction surfaced like a bubble. The acrostic poem, the crowned lion watermark, the phrasing that sounded pastoral yet formal. It had been Doran's voice hidden in those lines, not Lucinda's. He had tried to cast her shadow across the mirrors, to divert suspicion from himself. I sat on the bench inside the confessional, feeling the wood press against my back. Through the mirrored panel, the chapel looked both familiar and strange, a reversed world where the altar appeared to the left instead of the right. My own reflection stared back with a patience that unsettled me. A crossword clue had lingered in my pocket for days. Cleric conceals secret in reflection, saw 6. The answer flickered now. Curate, or karate, or perhaps simply Doran. Yet even as the pieces aligned, they did so without triumph. The motive was not greed alone, but reputation, the ownership of a manuscript whose value lay in prestige rather than coin. The morning bell began to toll outside, slow and deliberate, shaking dust from the rafters. I replaced the papers in their compartment and closed the panel softly. Its seam vanished once more, leaving only a faint line like a healed scar. As I walked back down the aisle, the mirrored panel caught a sliver of light and for an instant showed not my own face, but, impossibly, Elaine's, or some echo of her, turned slightly as though listening. When I blinked, it was gone. I stepped out into the quadrangle. The rain had begun again, soft as breath. The college roofs blurred under it, and the day smelled of stone and wet paper. In my pocket, the crossword clue pressed against my fingers, still unsolved, but closer. Another face behind the glass, waiting. The chapel at St. Hilda and Cuthbert smelled of damp hymnals and the faint mineral tang of plaster dust. Workmen had left their ladders propped like spindly crosses against the walls, and their absence lent the place a suspended quality, as though time had been pressed between 2 sheets of glass. Even song rehearsal had begun before our arrival. Voices drifted through the nave like a tide, rising, then falling, phrases without consonants. Lewis and I stood near the back. The choir, a ragged mixture of students and parish regulars, gathered in the chancel under the supervision of Father Doran. He moved among them with the small gestures of someone accustomed to quiet influence, one hand indicating a phrase, the other resting on the music stand. His cassock swayed with each step, a muted pendulum. I waited until the organ ceased and the echoes thinned. Lewis cleared his throat, a sound absorbed instantly by the stone. Father Doran turned, saw us, and his face remained as composed as the painted saints behind him. He walked down the aisle, the choir parting without a word. We spoke without formalities. He asked if something new had arisen. I said there were papers found in the confessional. Elaine Marston's missing notes and a draft will naming him her literary executor. His gaze flickered once, a shadow of recognition. He said he had nothing to hide. Lewis stood a little behind me, silent. The chapel felt colder than the quadrangle outside, the kind of cold that clings to memory. I told Doran the poem had been his. The watermark, the phrasing, the misquoted line etched into the mirror. I said it softly, as though naming a ghost. He did not deny it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was almost part of the stonework. He said Elaine had found the manuscript he had hidden, a devotional text of immense value, and threatened to expose his ownership. She had planned to announce it at the anniversary lecture, to shame him. He said he had invited her to the mirror room under the pretext of retrieving her notes, intending only to persuade her to delay, to protect the college's reputation and his own. The choir had begun a psalm again, very softly. Their voices reached us in broken syllables like waves through a cave mouth. Doran's hands trembled once before folding together. He said there had been an argument. She pulled away. He tried to stop her leaving. She slipped, struck her head on the edge of the mirror frame. The rest, the hiding of her notes, the anonymous poem, had been panic. He had hoped to misdirect us toward Vale, to let suspicion settle where it already threatened to fall. I watched his mouth form the words, but heard something else. Not confession, not contrition, but the weary cadence of a man narrating a story he has told himself enough times to believe. The psalm ended on a high, unresolved note, leaving the chapel silent except for our breathing. A crossword clue stirred at the back of my mind. Cleric's cover hides truth. 6. I almost smiled at the neatness of it. Doran asked if I understood. He said the college could not withstand another scandal. He said Elaine had been reckless. He said he had prayed for forgiveness. His voice was calm, yet each sentence seemed to shorten as though the air itself were thinning. Lewis finally spoke, his tone measured, telling Doran it was time to come with us. Doran nodded once, a gesture of resignation more than compliance. He walked past us toward the great door. As he passed the mirrored panel near the confessional, his reflection wavered for a moment beside mine. Two figures merged and indistinct. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the chapel roof. I followed them out, the echo of the choir still clinging to my ears. In my pocket, the folded poem felt lighter, as though its work were done, yet some part of me sensed that the mirror still held another story, one not yet spoken. The case had ended with less ceremony than it deserved. Papers signed, statements taken, a quiet arrest arranged out of sight of the college's windows. By the time Lewis drove off, was already walking, drawn back to the water without deciding to go. The Cherwell lay under a sky that had turned the color of pewter, the air damp but no longer raining. Leaves clung to the footpath like scattered notes of a song no one wished to play. I followed the same route I had taken weeks earlier, when the first anonymous poem arrived like an echo from a future I had not yet met. The trees leaned inward over the water, their branches almost bare now, their reflections trembling on the surface. The smell of wood smoke drifted from some unseen fire across the meadow. It mingled with the damp scent of reeds and river mud. and behind it all, a faint metallic tang, like the edge of a struck bell. The misquoted Herbert line rose unbidden. The glass shows not the face, but the soul's residue. Not his words, not mine, yet they had become the thread of the whole affair. Mirrors that hold another face, not yours, not mine, but something both present and absent. I had traced those words from a lecture hall to a chapel, from a photograph to a hidden compartment, and still they gave no final answer. Perhaps they never had one. I paused on the small footbridge. The planks were slick beneath my shoes. In the river below, the college spires stretched and wavered, turned upside down like a reflection rehearsing a different life. My own image drifted there, pale and elongated, the coat collar high against the dusk. I thought of Elaine Marston, of her notes tied with a dark ribbon, of Father Doran's voice in the chapel, low and steady as he spoke of accident and panic. A story told in quiet tones, perhaps true, perhaps only practiced. The crossword clue that had lingered in my pocket for days surfaced again. Soul seen backwards in glass. 4. The answer hovered like a shy bird just out of reach. I let it go. Some clues are solved by forgetting them. A boat appeared around the bend, gliding without sound except for the gentle dip of oars. In the stern sat a woman whose face I could not see, her coat pale against the dark water. A thread of laughter drifted across the river, soft, brief, and impossible to locate. It might have been a gull, or memory, or the same voice from that first afternoon. She raised her hand slightly as the boat passed, or perhaps it was only the oar lifting. Then she was gone, the ripples closing behind her like a line erased from a page. I stayed on the bridge as the light thinned. The college bells began their slow evening toll, each note spreading across the meadows before dissolving. My reflection in the river wavered with the sound, broken into slivers by a passing gust. I thought of Lucinda Sharp's absence from the photograph, of Vale's rehearsed indignation, of Doran's hands circling the flask. So many faces, each mirrored yet never the same. The wind shifted and carried the scent of wet paper from somewhere. Perhaps a notebook forgotten on a bench. Perhaps nothing at all. I leaned on the railing and watched the water darken until it resembled ink in a basin. The sky deepened to a color without name, and the last of the day slid from the spires into the current. In the river's glass, Morse saw only himself, and even that image was already fading.